And I've spoken to a number of Canadian journalists who are at the top of their profession, I would say, and they're definitely reporting the tendency to self-censor and a concern that if they say the wrong thing, and this last round was about cultural appropriation, that they're going to be targeted by the internet mob, roughly speaking, and be hung out to dry by their colleagues, for example. And so,
well, let me touch that, because I think a lot of people aren't operating from necessarily the same kind of knowledge base as you are. Explain for people, you've talked a lot about this kind of classical Marxist theory, which is shape-shifted. I'm the one with the mixed metaphors. It's shape-shifted into, I mean, would we say that it's more so shape-shifted into identity politics? Would we also say kind of classical Marxist theory has shifted into postmodernism? I mean,
What the fuck? So postmodernism now is Marxism, if you didn't know. Yep.
A lot of people aren't necessarily familiar with these terms, but they're ubiquitous on campus.
Yeah, well, there's a very good book by Stephen R. Hicks that I would recommend. I believe it's called Explaining Postmodernism. It's either that or Understanding Postmodernism.
He also takes Objectivism by Ayn Rand seriously.
But it's definitely Stephen R. Hicks, and I would recommend that highly to any of your viewers, especially the first chapter, because it explains how that shape-shifting process occurred. And as far as I can tell, by the late 60s, early 70s, the idea that the West was going to be overwhelmed by a workers' rebellion and move in a radically left direction, that was dead in the water. And then, of course, all the horror stories started to emerge in an undeniable fashion about exactly how barbaric both Mao's China and Stalin's USSR, not only Stalin, also Lenin, how barbaric those places really were. And it became very...
Don't cite anything about Mao or Lenin or anything. Just say they're barbaric, and everybody will believe you. Just ignore all the evidence on the contrary that shows that Mao got rid of slavery, got rid of the warlords, increased the life expectancy and gave free public education and better health care to everybody in China, and that he also gave women equal rights, basically. They weren't second-class citizens anymore. And Stalin, basically the same thing, but, he's too deep on that black book of communism to even think. I think he's just spouting stuff that he learned from school, just like people like I used to do.
Intellectually untenable to maintain a pure Marxist attitude in the face of both of those things.
Sure.
With the rapid rise of living standards for the working class people in Europe and in the West in general. And what happened, as far as I can tell, and this happened mostly in France and under the direction of the postmodernists like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, among others, they just did a sleight of hand, and they exchanged economics for power, and they exchanged economic oppression for identity politics oppression, and just continued right along with the same devastating, resentful, rigid, one-dimensional ideology that's now become, I would say, paramount, particularly in the humanities, in the administration as well, or often in the administration among the student activists. It's the dominant ideology, and it's really a toxic, horrible ideology.
I'm so glad to hear.
Yeah, postmodernism is not a dominant ideology. I don't know where these people live or where they're from, but I mean, if they are, I'll move there.
You say that because we talked about, before the election, for example, Bernie Sanders. We just talked about this the other day, where HuffPost said socialism is cool again.
It's so hot right now.
Yeah, so hot right now. Thanks, Bernie Sanders. That was the actual.
Bernie Sanders. That was the actual.
Liberals talking about socialism, and they think Bernie Sanders is a socialist when he's a social democrat. It makes me shake my head.
Headline. By the way, bell bottoms, you know nothing of women's fashion. You're a horrible not gay man, Jared. But it was, if you said socialism with Barack Obama, I was raised in Quebec, basically socialist. I said, well, you secretly mean the N-word. It's a racial pejorative. And then Bernie Sanders said, no, it's democratic socialism. And I was always saying, listen, the two are inextricably tied. This idea of fiscal, like you're saying, economic authoritarianism to a degree. You can't remove that from identity politics. And we had a lot of people during the election cycle who said, well, actually, I really like Bernie on economics, but I don't like that he appeases Black Lives Matter. Since the election, he's gone full-bore socialism. Huffington Post doesn't even use democratic socialism anymore. It's right out there plain in the open.
It's valuable character space.
I think a lot of people have woken up to that. And so
He obviously doesn't know what he's talking about.
I mentioned that you would say, yeah, that transition occurred when economically it was no longer viable. It made that transition culturally. And it seems like recently, since the left is losing the culture, and you're brilliant on this, they try and shoehorn economics back in there.
Yeah, well, and I'm not so sure they're losing. You know, I mean, I don't believe that the radical leftist types, the professional protesters and so forth, are represent a very large proportion of the population, but the degree to which they're organized and effective can't be underestimated. And they've been, and I think a large part of that is because the intellectuals, let's say, who lead the activist movements have been subsidized both by private forces and also by public forces in the universities for 40 years. And we've raised generations of youthful activists who've been trained by people who have the luxury, let's say, of doing nothing but pursuing their radical utopian dreams in their spare time and doing everything they can to push that forward. And it doesn't take that many people.
Jordan Peterson saying to do anything you want in your life except create a radical utopian society. Well, fuck your dreams. You want world peace? Well, you can't have that, according to Jordan Peterson. He gives motivational speeches saying to do whatever you want. My God.
A society to have a very powerful effect if they're well organized and noisy and effective. And
look at Islamic terrorism. It's a very, very congruent.
Right. Well,
we'll look at the Spanish Inquisition or the apartheid state of Israel or a history book.
You know, and the majority of people generally also stay silent. Mm-hmm. And I think part of the reason I've been left alone as well, and I should highlight this, is that I have received overwhelming public support. And it's not only from individuals, although that's been a tremendous help, all the people who wrote to the university and who signed petitions, but also the journalists in Canada swung to my side pretty quickly in November once they...
The reason you haven't been fired is because you're an establishment status quo person who isn't radical. David Graeber gets fired because he's an actual anarchist. You're just a guy who thinks trans people are weird. No shit, the journalists swung to your side. All journalists are mostly repeaters nowadays. They basically support wars and don't challenge the status quo, so of course they would support you. My God, even Rachel Maddow would support you. And you're on a conservative talk show, like you're as status quo as it gets.
Started looking into what I was saying and determining that I wasn't merely scaremongering and that I wasn't uninformed, that the reason that I was complaining about or criticizing, let's say, some of the legislative moves that Canada was making, I had my facts in order, and I do have my facts in order. And the bill that I was specifically objecting to, Bill C-16, is still, it's still in front of the Senate. That's been interesting, too.
Can you explain that to the American audience who may not be aware of it? Now, I've told them for a long time, a lot of people don't, there's no constitution, not the same constitution in Europe, in Canada. Freedom of speech doesn't exactly exist there. So that's important, regardless of any other law being put forward, to understand. And that's why I listen, I'm always concerned for someone like you.
Being prosecuted.
Yeah, comedians being put before human rights tribunals. But tell the American audience who might not be aware about Bill C.
Fuck you. Where are these tribunals? I can't believe I'm gonna watch this whole thing, but fuck, I'm gonna do it.
16.
Well, Bill C-16 is a federal bill, and it purports to do nothing but add gender identity and gender expression to the list of categories against which you cannot discriminate in Canada. And it also alters the Canadian criminal code to make discrimination and harassment under those grounds potential grounds for being pursued under the hate speech provisions. And hate speech provisions are...
You know, Jordan Peterson brings up a good point here. We should absolutely discriminate against trans and non-binary people. Great idea. It wouldn't lead to suicidal thoughts or anything. It's not like scientists have found that gender operations have prevented suicides in gender dysphoric people, and that people who are trans or intersex get discriminated against. Yeah, that doesn't happen at all. Yeah. It's not like there are hate crimes against trans people, you know? We should absolutely not let hate speech against these people be criminalized. This guy has a good point. My God, why didn't I think about this before?
That's right. This has changed quite a bit. And you've talked about this. You've talked about how strength is the only sort of language that they understand, that they speak. Now, Dinesh D'Souza has talked about how, you know, certain virtues were not virtues until modern Christendom. For example, mercy. It wasn't. Mercy was considered a weakness. How do we balance, obviously, as Christians?
Mercy didn't exist before Christianity. How do you prove that? I've looked far and wide, and I can't find evidence that mercy only started in the last 2,000 years. There was no mercy in humans in the past 198,000 years before then? I mean, is that what he's saying? Also, Judaism and Islam talk about mercy all the time. I've read the Quran. Mercy is mentioned several times and says how God is most merciful. And yes, Muslims only understand violence. Ignore the fact that giving to the poor is mandatory in Islam. Unless you can't do it, it's something called the zakat. If you've ever read the Quran or know... I mean, it's obvious he doesn't know anything about Islam and hasn't educated himself. He's just a reactionary. But I would implore him to educate himself on the subject.
More of the opinion that the more toxic forms of totalitarian Sharia law are built right into Islam as a structure. But I've talked to other people, and
no, Sharia law was the first thing to come out of Islam. You can watch the Caspian's Report series on this, or you could read the Quran and the Sunnah. Sharia law was only interpreted afterwards, and over a long period of time.
Imam in Winnipeg, for example, who seems to be a reasonable person, who's of the opinion that general democratic laws, like the ones that are characteristic of Canada and the US, can be regarded as Sharia as long as they uphold certain kinds of moral virtues. So, you know, it's like any religious structure is unbelievably complicated, and people interpret it in a very large number of ways. And what I'm hoping is that there's grounds for a real discussion between people who are of the Islamic faith and people in the West, so that we can find a way forward that will work out mutually, because the alternative just seems to be too catastrophic to really contemplate.
But do we think on a pragmatic level that may be where we're headed? I mean, I'm not talking about moderate Muslims in Canada, but you have hundreds of millions of people who believe in death for apostasy or blasphemy. I mean, it's just what I talked about yesterday, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong here. I really am interested in your insight. I was saying, never have we before have we had a society that is so advanced technologically, economically, I mean, as far as weaponry, like we have with Western civilization, who have kowtowed and acquiesced to someone, to such a regressive society. I mean, usually it used to be like, oh my gosh, we came up with this new way where we know we can win wars, and you take over everyone else's stuff. Now the only weapon, it seems, that these terrorists have, as you see after the Manchester bombing, is guilt. And the social justice warrior sort of postmodernists who appease them, right? They feel guilty to speak out against Islamic terror. That's really the only weapon they have that's effective. And as you said, I worry on that front, they might be winning more than losing.
Yeah, well, I don't really know what to say about that. I mean, I think that the more radical end of the Islamic spectrum is unbelievably good at manipulating the strange social justice warrior affinity for the more radical ends of Islamic thought. I think they're superb at doing that. They're superb tacticians.
Sure.
And the question you're asking to some degree is, and I suppose you might even think about this from a Christian perspective, is that what are the limits of mercy and tolerance? And that's a really complicated question. Do you tolerate intolerance? I mean, the radical left would say definitely not, because of course they're willing to shut down anyone who they regard as intolerant. And
this guy thinks liberal and social democrats are left. I mean, this guy, Jordan Peterson right here, has no idea what he's talking about.
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, the answer that I've been putting forward, generally speaking, to the problem of the inevitability of human conflict, generally speaking, is for people to strengthen themselves as individuals, because I think that as a global solution, it's kind of a low-resolution solution, but strong people make strong families, and strong families make strong communities, and strong communities make a society that's very difficult to undermine or overthrow. And I think that's been one of the real strengths of the West, because it's partly reflected in the fact that we're not authoritarian.
The U.S. is authoritarian. In fact, 70% of people have no representation in government, according to the Princeton study. Cross-state voter ID laws gave the presidency to Trump. The rich elect our representatives, and they destroy the ones they don't like Mel Slavic in Delaware, Bernie Sanders, Henry Wallace, Eugene Debs, or anybody really that stands in their way. I mean, it's been done before in this country. And also, I mean, the fact that we don't elect our own presidents. It's a group of electors that vote. That's not a democracy. That's like a minority rule over the majority of the population. I mean, that's not even a conspiracy theory. I mean, that's just a fact.
So, for example, if you take out the president, and even maybe if you take out the president and all of the Congress, American democracy would still survive, because it's so well distributed across the entire population in every sort of institution, and even at a personal level, that it's very difficult to eradicate.
Very different than North Korea, for instance, which would probably crumble.
Well, that's exactly the problem. People say, well, aren't
North Korea has no homeless people. Go fuck yourself. And also the U.S. bombed it to smithereens. It literally bombed the shit out of North Korea. They bombed them so much that they had to bomb dams, which was a war crime, and we did it because they ran out of targets. Don't talk to me about, why North Korea is so bad.
Strong families, you mentioned. I mean, for a long time, they were just sort of poo-pooed when sort of Christian conservatives would say, well, listen, there is an attack on the foundation of society, the family. And some of them were obviously fear-mongering. Some of them went too far. But it certainly does seem, and it seems there's a weird...
Nuclear families are a recent phenomenon that's only occurred since the Neolithic Revolution, past 12,000 to 10,000 years. You could read Sex at Dawn, which compiles a bunch of archaeological information that proves my point very well. Most people lived in 150-person tribes where everybody would have sex with each other, basically. And there would be no identifying whose kid is who. A lot of these societies had an idea where they would mix semen, and that's how you made kids. So a woman would get, have sex with a bunch of guys, and that's how they thought babies were made. So this guy is, once again, full of shit. Doesn't know what he's talking about.
Human studies websites, for example, and much of the humanities is devoted to that, because they truly regard the West as I would say as the equivalent of what the communists used to call the oppressive bourgeoisie. The only reason the West is wealthy, it has nothing to do with our structures of government or anything like that. It's because we've raped the planet and every other civilization and society and stolen all their wealth and distributed to a very small number of people. And the thing is rotten right to the core. It's rotten because men dominate it. It's rotten because it's predicated on the idea of logic and the logos, which is a really deep criticism. And
holy shit, he's got something right.
Brought to its knees.
Yes.
At every level of categorization.
Yes, it is.
Perception.
Rotten
that's why they're so.
Yes.
That's why the anti-unconscious bias training has become so popular, because you can actually that gives you the opportunity, at least in theory, to actually re-educate people out of their actual perceptions, not just their thoughts.
Right.
And so there's no reason to underestimate the seriousness of this assault, in my estimation. Now, that doesn't mean that every person who's a university student who's sort of enamored of neo-Marxism and postmodernism is a deadly
Neo-Marxism isn't a thing.
threat to Western civilization. But
They're just annoying.
yeah, well, and they're also fragments. They're fragments of an idea.
Yeah.
But if you put enough fragments of an idea together, you get the whole idea acting, and that's exactly what's happening now. And you don't want to underestimate the power of ideas. Ideas move mountains, they move continents, and this is an idea that has deep roots in the humanities and the universities, and it's extraordinarily toxic.
Yeah.
There isn't anything about it that I can think of that's good. It's all destructive.
Strong words. Strong. When I don't know about you, but when Professor Peterson just said brought to its knees in every level, I had a mild erection. Anyone else? It was. I got a chill like on the inside. When I was like,
This intellectual conversation all of a sudden. Steve.
I know he's fucking gay. I think everybody knows, right?
Sorry, apologies. No, I think because you have talked a lot
It's good talking to you. What's going to
Throw
happen
some
next.
comedy and humor in there every once in a while.
I do think that you've talked about this quite a bit, and there are a lot of obviously other intellectuals who talk about this. How you said at the center of Western civilization. So now we've just talked about Western civilization sort of versus Marxism, and I think that's really, not to simplify it, but I think that is kind of the intellectual battle right now. You can disguise it any way you want. It's basically Western civilization, which is incompatible with Marxism, whether it's cultural Marxism, whether it's postmodernism, feminism, social justice warriorism, identity politics. It all stems from the same thing. We did a long video on Karl Marx, and actually you, not Jared, you even said, like, it just seems like everything now is being regurgitated, going back to Marx and Lenin.
Yeah.
But you said Western civilization, and I don't want to misquote you, that at the center of it is truth, that is so fundamentally important.
Talks about truth is so important. Yet is on a show that doesn't speak the truth and misrepresents ideas like Marxism and Native American history and others.
It's been quite interesting. We've managed to sell out a 500-seat theater for both lectures, which is pretty bloody remarkable. And about 200,000 people have watched the first one. But I'm trying to go back to the dream in some sense that underlies Western civilization, and part of that dream is that what brings proper being into being out of chaos is the spoken truth.
Yeah.
And I think I believe that presupposition is at the cornerstone of Western civilization, and with its tremendous emphasis on the moral obligation of each individual and each citizen to speak the truth. I think that's the paramount virtue. It's the virtue that's given the power to generate chaos out of order at the beginning.
Yes, only the West cares about the truth.
Here, so much of the combative answer to that is that there is no such thing as truth. The leftists will say and liberals will say that truth is whatever you define it to be. Your truth, live your truth. Do you think that's what they say? But the more I think about it, I don't know that they really believe that. I don't know.
Misrepresenting again. I haven't heard this, but what they probably mean by this is that no matter what the truth is, some people won't believe it regardless. Therefore, truth is subjective. Not because facts aren't real, but because people won't believe they are true regardless of the evidence. That's what they're trying to say. I mean, if they said what this guy was saying, I mean, yeah, obviously that's fucking stupid. Of course. No, like, that doesn't make any sense. He's just making up a straw man. I haven't read many postmodernists except, like, Chuck Palahniuk, Fight Club, and his other books, and these people don't have an idea of the concept. I mean, it seems like I understand it better, but like, oh my god.
That you can really arrive at that conclusion if you're thinking through anything logically. I think most people, say you got a father who's gone off the deep end, you want to bring him back the truth. Do you really think someone could argue in that situation that no, him being drunk and being his family is his truth? That's good?
You're asking, do you think, I guess, Professor, I think what you're...
It's my truth, so I can be drunk and beat my kids. That's probably not what Foucault wrote, or Derrida, or any of these other postmodernist philosophers, which that guy hasn't read, obviously.
You're asking is, do you think that the left actually believes that truth is subjective, or do you think they just use it as an out logically?
I think they tend to use it whenever it's convenient for their argument. I mean, I think the radical leftists, they don't even, as far as I can tell, they regard the idea of coherence, logical coherence, let's say, as part of the oppressive structure that they're trying to fight against.
Right.
So the idea that they can say one thing at one moment and another thing at the other moment is perfectly fine as long as it serves whatever it is they think they're serving. I mean, part of the criticism of the West is...
Yes, I want to destroy logic. He figured me out. I want to go back to the days of the Holy Roman Empire where there was no science. How'd James Patterson know?
For example, like you're talking about with Bill C-16 on everyone else. In other words, say, well, we don't believe in these constraints, which happen to be biological, historical, logical, factual, so we're going to create...
Gender isn't just a boy or a girl, there's a spectrum. Gender is independent of sex. For example, even though I'm a guy, I had a DEXA scan and that showed that I have more gynoid than android fat, which is something that you find in women more often. Guys get more fat around their abdomen, or android fat, than gynoid fat. So there is a spectrum. It's not just black or white. And also, I've had a gay experience before. Oh my god! And the reason I'm kind of hesitant to say things about that is because people get persecuted and disgusted by people who admit things like that, and get discriminated against, and lose their jobs, and lose friends and stuff. That's the whole point of Bill C-16, which would just stop discrimination against these people who don't behave in their assigned gender roles. Alright.
These constraints basically on you so that you can't speak in a way that we don't like. Not Jared, you had a question.
Yeah, how would you combat the argument, though, that progressives would say, well, sometimes progress needs to take place in the face of social or historical constraints. There are times in history we can see like slavery or things that happen in the Middle Eastern cultures that would be true. What kind of constraints navigate those situations and kind of dissect and weed out, transgender issues from, say, slavery issues? What kind of
that's a good question.
Guide that kind of progress?
It's a good question. I mean, for me, it's never been, the transgender issue isn't the issue. It's the side issue. It's like, so with regards to discrimination, let's say, for me, that's a pretty straightforward issue. So you got to look at the context within. The first thing I should say about that is that people need to be allowed to discriminate. And that's something no one ever says. Discrimination is unbelievably important. The best example of that, and we're going to end up in a fight about this, I would say, over the next 5 years, is that people constantly, including the social justice warrior types, reserve the right to discriminate sexually. And that's why they're so concerned with such things as sexual harassment and sexual assault, because they regard the right to discriminate sexually as a paramount right. But it's not self-evident from within the confines of their theory why that should be the case. Like, why should you be allowed to hurt someone's feelings if they want to sleep with you and you don't want to sleep with them? I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to base your criteria on health? Yes. On looks? Yes. On the admirability or the admirable qualities of the person? Yep. Usually on race, often on religion. You're going to give all that up?
Yeah. As in not get Jared case, it's the utilities. It's kind of like a sexual potluck. So, don't come empty-handed.
Sometimes if you don't have any
choice.
Don't
trust the casserole.
Well, you have to take what comes your way. But I'm talking more fortunate than that.
Yes.
But so the first thing is that we can't forget that not only is discrimination necessary, but that it's one of the most basic rights, and it's associated with freedom of association. And the most tangible example of freedom of association is freedom to choose your sexual partner. And so that the social justice warrior types are going to run afoul of that. They already are in some sense, because the transgender people are complaining that they're not given the same sexual preference as normative. Geez. Well, but it goes along with the same logic. And in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World.
Okay, you should be allowed to discriminate, obviously, like the way he's saying, but that's not what SJWs say. Nobody should ever get rejected ever again. You have to have sex with anyone that wants to have sex with you. Strawmans. That's not what SJWs say. See, I used to be an anti-SJW, and I thought this shit was Orwellian. And I mean, he's coming up with the Brave New World, Aldous Huxley reference. I mean, yeah, I used to think it was like crazy, but then I looked into it, and I figured out that right-wingers weren't representing SJWs correctly, and I should probably listen to SJWs and listen to what they're talking about instead of, listen to Stephen Crowder explain it, who clearly doesn't understand it. But yeah, obviously, like, SJWs aren't forcing you to have sex with somebody you don't want to have sex with. That's retarded. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah,
Doesn't
right.
help.
I agree, and I think that, and we do have to. I wanted to do this. Maybe we can do it next time. Someone did ask Kianan Matern, can you, Professor Peterson, can you do a Big Five personality analysis of Crowder and share it with the audience? Maybe we can do that for next time. We can do it somewhat off air, and you can embarrass me. But I agree with you there. I think we're coming together with it. You can't prove every single word that was said that's written down from the Bible. It's not necessarily a transcription, but the totality of the historical context, the corroborations, the evidence outside of just the biblical timeline. At a certain point, I think, like Professor Peterson is saying, you have to determine what you believe the truth to be. And that is one that not anyone has the answer. There's a certain element of faith there.
Yeah, and I think historically, as you look at how we
just wrapped this up nicely. Do not try and open this back up.
I was just going to say you're right. I was going to say,
There's one other thing to consider, too, with regards to belief. I mean, belief isn't necessarily allegiance to a set of facts. And it might even be more importantly in relationship to Christian belief that it's the decision about how to act.
Yeah.
And there's an idea, and this is, I think, most well developed in Orthodox Christianity, is that your moral duty is to act out the archetypal pattern of Christ in your own life. And what that essentially means is that to tell the truth in the manner that suits and fits you best.
That's why I believe there's such a problem with Islam, because of Muhammad and the way that he acted is very different. If everyone acted like Christ, be a little bit weird. You might be like, hey, the guy's overly friendly. Muhammad, everyone would be jailed. And we can talk about that next time you come on. Do you think you can do the Big Five personality analysis next time when we can share it with the audience?
Well, I can tell you a little bit about your personality. You're a pretty agreeable person. You like people and you're friendly. You're very, very extroverted, right? You're off the charts extroverted. You're pretty high in openness. You may have noticed that. Extrovert. My suspicions is that your conscientiousness is probably somewhere in the medium range, because you wouldn't be a comedian if you were highly conscientious. It's just not something, like, to be an entertainer isn't something that.
Well, you got something right. Stephen Crowder isn't conscientious and doesn't think about what he's saying. Yep, totally right.
Someone who's really conscientious can be, because the lifestyle is too unstructured. And so that's, and in terms of negative emotion, I would suspect probably higher than average. That's neuroticism. I would suspect probably higher than average, but certainly off the charts for
There you go. He already put me on the couch. Okay, well, let's do this. We'll do it more in depth next time, because I'm interested. Whenever I take these little.
You could take a personality test and we could go through it.
Okay, that sounds like fun. And for those who are watching, Tommy Loren tomorrow. Send your questions out there on YouTube, and we'll be talking about Donald Trump's budget proposal regarding education. That's been really controversial. See you then.
Well, I saw the whole thing, and now I'm gonna go puke. All right, thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you like videos similar to this. And remember, nothing's simply black or white. There's nuance to everything. Thanks.